what if the key to, beating a severe chronic addiction isn't about fighting harder, but actually just giving up completely? I mean, it sounds totally backwards, aren't they?
Absolutely. It's completely counterintuitive.
Because we are so conditioned to think that overcoming a massive obstacle, especially addiction, is all about just gritting your teeth,
Mm.
doubling down on your discipline, and using raw willpower to basically force a behavioral change.
Yeah, the traditional narrative is like entirely built around the strength of the self. The underlying assumption is always just that if you're failing, well, you simply aren't trying hard enough. When you look closely at the actual neurobiology of severe substance use disorders, you start to see that the very executive functioning required to, try harder is exactly what the addiction has structurally compromised in the brain.
Right. And that structural compromise is really the core of our deep dive today.
Mm.
We've got this massive stack of sources in front of us: clinical performance data, deep neurobiological research, some really fascinating video transcripts, and large-scale meta-analyses. And we're using all of this material to explore a highly specific question for you today.
Which is such a fascinating question.
It really is. We're asking,
Yeah.
what is the actual clinical efficacy of divine love and Christian spirituality when it comes to addiction recovery outcomes?
Yeah, and it's a profound topic. I mean, it is just packed with some truly surprising data. But before we get into the actual mechanisms, I think we really need to set an important boundary with you right up front.
Definitely. I'm glad you brought that up.
Because faith, religion, spirituality, these are incredibly personal and, let's be honest, highly polarizing topics for a lot of people. So we want to be remarkably clear that our goal today is not to preach to you, like, at all.
Exactly. We are not taking sides here, and we certainly aren't endorsing any specific theology or worldview.
Right. Our job is just to objectively report on the evidence sitting in front of us. We're looking at the psychological, the clinical, and the neurobiological data just to understand exactly how and why these faith-based programs are showing such specific, measurable results in the real world.
So to really understand the spiritual solution that's presented in the sources, we first have to completely redefine the problem of addiction itself. We have to look at why those conventional willpower-based models of recovery often crack under pressure. Because the sources note that standard secular models frequently hover at a 40 to 60% relapse rate.
Yeah, roughly 40 to 60%, which is just staggeringly high. And that failure rate is so high because standard models often treat addiction primarily as a physical dependency, right? Or like a behavioral habit that just needs to be broken through sheer cognitive effort.
Just break the habit, basically.
Exactly. But the discipline of psychospirituality redefines addiction entirely. It frames it as what they call an existential displacement.
Existential displacement.
Hmm.
Okay, what does that actually mean for the person struggling, like on a day-to-day basis?
Well, the paradigm here posits that human beings have this innate baseline drive for wholeness. We have a fundamental orientation toward ultimate meaning. But in the mechanics of addiction, that innate drive gets hijacked.
It gets rerouted.
Right. It gets diverted and anchored to finite compulsive attachments. The source text literally describes it as nailing the individual's energy to material objects. So they are taking a deeply ingrained, almost cosmic desire for something infinite, and they're trying to satisfy it with something chemical and finite.
When you describe it as nailing their energy, it actually brings to mind like a massive high-voltage industrial appliance. Just this huge machine engineered to draw an almost infinite amount of power from a main grid.
Oh, that's a great way to picture it.
Right.
Yeah.
But instead of plugging it into that massive grid where it belongs, you try to plug it into like a cheap, finite little wall outlet in some dingy motel room. I mean, the system's going to overheat and fry every single time.
It fries every time. The circuitry just overloads. The brain is relentlessly searching for ultimate meaning, and when it keeps settling for a chemical substitute, the actual neurological hardware begins to break down.
Wow.
And the sources connect this phenomenon to an ancient Augustinian concept called the divided will. It's this state of profound, tearing internal restlessness. A person genuinely wants to recover, but they are simultaneously experiencing an overwhelming compulsion toward complete self-destruction.
So they are literally completely torn apart from the inside, like fighting a war on two fronts.
Exactly, and researchers have actually mapped that ancient theological idea of restlessness directly onto modern neuroscience, which is wild. They point straight to a dysregulated default mode network, or DMN.
The DMN, right? We've talked about that before.
Yeah, and instead of healthy self-reflection, addiction traps the DMN in this hyperactive loop of ruminative self-referential anxiety. The brain just gets stuck in this exhausting cycle where it mistakes a material chemical satisfaction for the ultimate aim of life. Which, by the way, perfectly mirrors the extreme egocentrism that the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous identified like decades ago as the root cause of the disorder.
Okay, so if the brain's will, this default mode network, is fundamentally broken and trapped in these obsessive loops, you obviously can't rely on that same willpower to get sober. I mean, you can't use a broken tool to fix the broken tool.
Precisely. The broken tool can't fix itself.
And the sources suggest that faith somehow bypasses this broken will entirely. But I have to push back here on behalf of our listeners, because we usually think of recovery as taking back control of your life. You get sober so you can be the one driving the car again.
Right. It's the secular narrative, yeah.
So doesn't this whole concept of surrendering to God just sound like replacing one crutch, the drugs, with another crutch, which is religion? I mean, it feels a bit like an abdication of personal agency.
It's a very common critique, and I get why you're asking that. It sounds paradoxical on the surface, but the sources address this through a really fascinating, measurable psychological concept called humble detachment.
Humble detachment.
Yeah. In a clinical context, surrender isn't about losing your agency or just becoming passive and lazy. It actually operates as a highly effective cognitive labor-saving device.
A cognitive labor-saving device.
Correct.
Okay, how does that function mechanically?
Well, just consider the immense metabolic and emotional burden of managing an addiction every single day. I mean, it takes a massive amount of processing power to constantly fight cravings, to manage the overwhelming shame, and to hypermonitor your own behavior constantly.
It sounds exhausting.
It is entirely exhausting. But by utilizing humble detachment, the individual undergoes a measurable transfer of exertion. They are literally transfer the heavy lifting of recovery from their own exhausted executive functioning over to a higher power.
Oh, so it's essentially like cloud computing for the human brain.
Cloud computing, yes.
Like if I have an old dusty laptop and I try to render a massive 4K video locally on its hard drive, the fan is going to scream, it's going to overheat, and the whole thing just crashes.
Right, the local hardware can't handle it.
Exactly. But if I offload that heavy processing power to a massive external server in the cloud, my local machine can actually run smoothly because it's not doing the heavy lifting anymore.
That is the perfect analogy. You are offloading the processing power so the local system doesn't overheat and fail. And the research actually divides this offloading into two distinct types.
Okay, what are they?
First, there is explicit surrender to God, or explicit STG. This is the conscious, active, in-the-moment act of praying when you are facing an intense temptation. And the data shows this is a strong predictor of short-term, one-month abstinence.
So it's a highly effective tool for getting through like an immediate crisis.
Right, the acute moment.
But you can't just live in a state of constant acute crisis management forever. I mean, that takes way too much energy over the long haul.
Which is exactly why the second type is so crucial, implicit STG. This is an automatic, non-conscious association with divine support. Over time, it just becomes a baseline reality for the individual.
It just runs in the background.
Exactly, like a background OS. And this drastically reduces the metabolic burden over the long haul. In fact, the data shows that this implicit surrender drops the odds of relapse over a one-year period to an odds ratio of 0.371.
Wow, that's a massive drop.
The risk plummets because they simply aren't fighting the current every single second of the day anymore. They are letting themselves be carried by a broader structural belief.
Okay, that sounds incredibly peaceful in theory. But how does this abstract idea of grace actually translate to physical changes in the brain's hardware? Like, if we look at a random Tuesday morning, how does this cognitive offloading actually rewire the physical neural pathways?
Well, to understand the physical rewiring, we have to look closely at something called reward deficiency syndrome, or RDS.
RDS, okay.
So long-term addiction fundamentally alters the brain's chemistry. It severely depletes what we call dopaminergic tone. The brain's dopamine receptors actually downregulate, they sort of turn themselves off to protect themselves from the massive chemical floods caused by the drugs or alcohol.
So they shrink back to defend the brain.
Exactly. And as a result, the baseline is totally depleted. The brain is literally starved of joy and cannot feel normal everyday contentment anymore. Spirituality, however, activates what researchers call the PMLR system.
What does PMLR stand for?
It stands for the purpose and meaning of life as reward.
Oh, wow. So finding profound spiritual purpose actually triggers the brain's reward centers naturally, rather than relying on a chemical spike to do it.
Exactly. It creates a slow drip, sustainable dopamine release. It provides internal contentment without requiring that destructive chemical shortcut. And furthermore, the sources detail how spiritual self-soothing and paced contemplative breathing actively down-regulate the amygdala.
And the amygdala is the brain's primary fear and threat center.
Right. It calms the alarm system.
Okay, I want you to walk me through what this looks like in a real-time scenario for our listeners. Say someone is, I don't know, 3 months sober. They are having a highly stressful Tuesday morning at work. Their baseline dopamine is obviously still recovering, and suddenly their phone buzzes.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, it's a text from an old drinking buddy inviting them out to a bar. Now, without an intervention, the amygdala flares up, panic sets in, and the DMN starts looping with these intense cravings. What does the spiritual intervention look like in that exact moment?
So the sources outline a specific neurocognitive application of divine love known as the RAIN method, R-A-I-N. It's a structured, moment-by-moment way to handle that exact trigger without relying on depleted willpower.
Let's break that down letter by letter. What's the R?
R stands for recognize. The individual acknowledges the craving without panicking or trying to instantly suppress it. They mentally note the somatic state, just saying something like, my heart is racing, my chest is tight, and I am feeling a severe craving right now.
So just naming the reality of the physical sensation, taking the mystery out of it. And what's the A?
A is allow. They let the feeling exist without fighting it or abandoning themselves to that divided will.
Wait, how does allow differ from just giving up and giving in to the craving? That sounds risky.
It's not about giving in, it's about removing the secondary layer of stress. Usually a craving triggers this immediate wave of toxic shame. They think, I'm 3 months sober, I shouldn't be feeling this, I'm a total failure.
Oh, I see.
Allowing it means realizing they aren't failing just because they had a biological craving, it's just a neurological response. By allowing it to exist without piling shame on top of it, the amygdala actually stops escalating the threat level.
That removes so much of the internal friction. Okay, what about the I?
I is investigate. They explore the deeper somatic trigger beneath the surface. They might ask, why is this text hitting me so hard right now? Let me check, and my shoulders are tense. Oh, I'm incredibly stressed about my boss today, and I'm feeling inadequate. So they trace the craving back to its emotional root.
Digging under the craving. And finally, N is nurture. How does the nurture step operate in a specifically spiritual context, as opposed to just, standard cognitive behavioral therapy?
That's the key distinction. In secular CBT, the goal might be to simply reframe the thought or use a grounding technique. But in the psychospiritual framework, instead of reaching for a substance to numb the stress, they apply the perspective of unconditional divine love directly to that emotional wound. They remind themselves that they are fundamentally held and valued by a flawless higher power. They are anchored in grace and do not need a chemical shortcut to survive Tuesday afternoon. It shifts the core identity from, I am an addict desperately fighting a craving, to, I am a spiritually anchored person experiencing a temporary physical sensation.
That is a massive paradigm shift. Changing that internal stress response is obviously crucial for getting through the acute crisis of a Tuesday morning text. But, if we zoom out, changing the internal hardware is only half the battle.
Right.
If you send a newly healed brain back into the exact same toxic environment, those new circuits are eventually going to short out. Long-term survival clearly requires external architectural support. So how does this framework change who the individual actually is out in the real world?
The social and relational dimensions of recovery are where this really becomes a lifestyle rather than just a coping mechanism. The sources introduce something called the SMILE scale, the Sorokin multidimensional inventory of love experience.
The SMILE scale. I like that.
Yeah, it's a psychometric tool that measures different types of love in a person's life. And researchers found that religious love, which is defined specifically as the subjective feeling of being embraced and accepted by God, correlates with the absolute lowest levels of anxiety and depression among all the dimensions they measured.
That has to serve as a massive psychological anchor for someone whose entire life has been destabilized by addiction.
It does, and we can connect this to the broader psychological framework of attachment theory. In human development, a healthy attachment figure provides a haven of safety when you are distressed, and a secure base from which you can confidently explore the world.
Like a good parent.
Exactly like a good parent. For individuals in these programs, God serves as that ultimate, flawless, secure base.
That has to be especially profound for individuals who have severe childhood trauma. Because, a significant portion of folks dealing with chronic addiction do not have healthy earthly caregivers to model that safe attachment after.
Sadly, yes. And the research addresses this specific dynamic through what's called the compensation hypothesis.
What's that?
When someone has suffered from abusive, insecure, or entirely absent childhood caregivers, they often turn to substances later in life to numb the profound lack of safety. But in this spiritual framework, they are presented with an unconditionally loving divine parent.
Oh, so they are compensating.
Exactly. They utilize this divine relationship to compensate for what they never received on Earth. It acts as the primary effective counterweight to a lifetime of toxic shame and insecurity.
I was reading through the sources, and the way they translate this internal identity shift into a literal physical map is just fascinating. There's a group called Celebrate Recovery, or CR, and they use a technique called social identity mapping.
Yes, it's a very powerful, tactile visual tool.
They actually have the individual sit down with a physical whiteboard, and when they start the exercise, the person still carries this heavily stigmatized label of the addict self. Their entire social network basically revolves around obtaining and using a substance.
Right, that's their whole world at that point.
So they draw nodes on this whiteboard representing their youth supportive networks. The old drinking buddies, the dealers, the family members who enable them. And then physically, they take a marker and they cross those nodes out one by one.
They're visually dismantling the old architecture that kept them sick.
Exactly. And then they deliberately draw new lines, connecting themselves to their sponsors, to sober friends, to members of their faith community. They're actively shedding that isolated addict self and stepping into a redeemed spiritual self. It's not just internal. They are explicitly drawing the map of their new survival network.
And that new network provides vital, load-bearing social capital. So, the psychological theory makes sense, the neurobiology aligns, and the social mapping provides structure. The ultimate question, though, is whether the hard clinical data actually reflects this architecture of grace working out in the messy real world.
Right. We need to look at the receipts. What do the actual numbers say across these massive sample sizes?
The clinical ledger is remarkably robust. There was a landmark meta-analysis published in JAMA Psychiatry that looked at 55 independent studies, encompassing over 540,712 participants.
Wait, over 500,000 people? That is an undeniably massive sample size for behavioral research.
It's huge. And the meta-analysis showed that general spiritual practices reduced the baseline risk of substance misuse by 13%. But when you add in weekly religious community attendance, that risk reduction jumps to 18%.
That's significant.
It gets better. The data on women specifically is just staggering. For women in recovery, weekly service attendance showed an 80% reduction in relapse risk.
80%, just from being embedded in that specific community architecture. That's incredible.
Yeah, and the sources also highlight Adult and Teen Challenge, or ATC, which is a rigorous 12 to 18-month residential discipleship model. The secular norm for relapse, as we discussed earlier, hovers around 40 to 60%, but ATC graduates show a sustained abstinence rate of 78 to 86%.
Wait, hold on a second. And an 86% success rate compared to 40 to 60% for standard secular rehabs.
That's what the data says.
Look, let's be critical thinkers here. If this were a newly patented pharmaceutical drug claiming an 86% success rate, scientists would be tearing the methodology apart looking for a catch. I mean, the numbers almost seem too good. What is skewing this data? We have to look at the methodological limitations here.
And that is exactly what any objective observer should ask. To be fair to the researchers, the sources impartially outline 3 major caveats that complicate these numbers and require us to look at the data with a very critical eye.
Okay, good. What's the first major blind spot?
The first is selection bias. People who willingly choose to enter a rigorous 12 to 18-month Christian residential program like ATC already possess a significantly higher baseline motivation than someone who is, say, mandated by a judge to attend a standard 30-day secular rehab just to avoid jail time.
Of course. So the starting line is completely different for those two groups. The person committing to 18 months is already highly, highly motivated to change their life.
Right. They are self-selecting into a demanding, immersive environment, which naturally skews the comparison group right from day one.
That makes perfect sense. What's the second caveat?
The second is selective attrition bias. This is notoriously common in longitudinal addiction studies. Simply put, people who relapse often just stop answering the phone.
Oh, because of the shame.
Exactly. They feel deep shame, so they don't fill out the 1-year or 5-year follow-up surveys. So if only the flourishing, successful graduates are reporting back to the researchers, it artificially inflates the program's overall success metrics. The denominator shrinks.
Right, the individuals who fall through the cracks essentially become invisible to the data set. That's a huge limitation.
It is. And the third limitation is what researchers refer to as the black box problem.
What does the black box refer to in this specific context?
Well, you can easily measure how many times a week someone attends a church service. You can measure their employment status or if they've had any new legal troubles. But you cannot accurately put the subjective, internal, transcendent experience of receiving divine grace onto a clinical Excel spreadsheet.
You can't quantify a spiritual awakening.
Exactly. The actual mechanism of spiritual transformation defies strict psychometric measurement. It happens inside a black box that science just can't perfectly quantify.
It's just too deeply personal and abstract to capture in a regression analysis.
But even with these three major methodological limitations, fully acknowledged, the selection bias, the attrition bias, and the black box problem, the overarching consensus of the data remains incredibly clear.
Which is?
For a substantial portion of the population, integrating this psychospiritual approach acts as load-bearing recovery capital. It provides a robust, multifaceted pathway out of severe addiction when standard cognitive willpower alone just fails.
Well, we have covered some seriously dense, profound territory today. We started by fundamentally redefining addiction, not just as a chemical hook or, a bad habit, but as an existential displacement where that deep drive for ultimate meaning gets completely hijacked.
Yeah, and we talked about the pure exhaustion of trying to use a broken will and how offloading that heavy metabolic burden through humble detachment actually allows the brain's physical hardware to finally heal.
Right, the cloud computing analogy. And we saw how adopting a divine, secure base compensates for profound childhood trauma, which stabilizes the amygdala. And then we explored how mapping out a new social identity visually tears down the isolation of the addict's self, replacing it with a supportive, load-bearing spiritual network.
It's a comprehensive restructuring of a person's life.
It really is. And while the clinical data isn't perfect, and it definitely has its inherent biases, the numbers point to something undeniable here. Spirituality provides an architectural framework that can actually bear the immense, crushing weight of long-term recovery. It seems to fill that infinite void that finite substances simply cannot.
It ultimately facilitates a holistic shift from mere day-to-day survival to actual sustainable human flourishing.
Beautifully put. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. Because even if you have never personally struggled with a substance use disorder, the core concept we discussed today, this idea of existential displacement, it really applies universally to human nature.
Oh, absolutely. We all have a default mode network that can get trapped in loops of anxiety and self-reference.
We all have an innate drive for ultimate meaning and wholeness. Every single one of us has that massive, infinite industrial appliance trying to draw power. So as you go about the rest of your week, I want you to ask yourself, what non-chemical, finite things are you currently plugging into?
That's a great question.
Maybe it's endlessly scrolling your social media feed looking for validation. Maybe it's the exhausting, never-ending pursuit of status or a compulsive obsession with your work. Whatever it is, what finite things are you currently nailing your energy to, trying to fill an infinite void? Think about it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we will see you next time.